Welcome back to our channel. Have you ever wondered how Pharaoh, the wicked ruler of Egypt, met his tragic end? The Bible introduces this Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, where he is depicted as a ruler who enslaved the Israelites, forcing them into brutal labor as builders and servants. The story of Pharaoh is one of the most dramatic tales of defiance, miracles, and divine power. This ruler, who thought himself untouchable, challenged God himself, and it didn't end well for him. But to truly understand how Pharaoh's life spiraled toward a catastrophic end, we need to go back to the beginning, the time when Egypt was at its peak, and the Israelites were suffering under Pharaoh's harsh rule. The unexpected death of Pharaoh. Pharaoh wasn't just any ruler. In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs were seen as gods walking the earth, wielding absolute power. They believed they held control over life, death, and destiny. This belief shaped how they governed and how they treated their subjects. When this particular pharaoh rose to power, the Israelites had already been living in Egypt for centuries. However, they were no longer the honored guests that had come during the time of Joseph. Instead, they had become slaves, forced to labor endlessly. Pharaoh was alarmed at how numerous the Israelites were becoming. He feared that one day they might rise up and overthrow the Egyptians. So, he devised a plan to suppress and control them. The Israelites were forced into grueling work, building the magnificent cities of Egypt and working in the fields. The Bible describes how the Egyptians made their lives bitter with hard service. Exodus 1:14. They were worked mercilessly, and their cries for help reached the heavens. But Pharaoh, hardened in his heart, showed no mercy. He increased their workload and treated them with cruelty, hoping to break their spirits. Pharaoh's cruelty didn't stop there. He issued one of the most horrific orders in the Bible: the killing of every Hebrew baby boy. He commanded that all male infants be thrown into the Nile River to drown. This act of genocide was Pharaoh's attempt to weaken the Israelites and ensure they didn't grow too powerful. But little did he know, one baby boy would escape his cruel plan. Moses, the one who would eventually challenge Pharaoh and lead his people to freedom. Moses' story is miraculous. Born to Hebrew parents during this dark time, his mother managed to hide him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she placed him in a basket and set him afloat on the Nile, hoping for a miracle. And a miracle did happen. Pharaoh's own daughter found the baby and decided to raise him as her own son. Moses grew up in the palace, surrounded by the wealth and power of Egypt. However, Moses never forgot his Hebrew roots. One day he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave and in a moment of anger, killed the Egyptian. Fearing for his life, Moses fled to the wilderness, leaving behind his royal upbringing. He spent years in exile, working as a shepherd. But God had a bigger plan for him. In the wilderness, Moses encountered God through the famous burning bush. This was no ordinary bush. It was engulfed in flames, yet it did not burn up. From the bush, God called out to Moses, instructing him to return to Egypt with a message for Pharaoh. "Let my people go." At first, Moses hesitated. He didn't feel worthy or capable of such a task. But God reassured him, and with his brother Aaron as his spokesperson, Moses returned to Egypt with a clear mission: to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. When Moses first approached Pharaoh, he simply asked for the Israelites to be allowed to go into the wilderness to worship their God. Pharaoh, however, was unimpressed. He dismissed Moses and refused to acknowledge the God of Israel, saying, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go?" Exodus 5:2. Pharaoh's response only made life harder for the Israelites. In a cruel act of retaliation, he increased their workload even more. They were now required to make the same number of bricks, but without being provided straw, a key material in brickmaking. This only intensified the suffering of the people. At this point, even the Israelites began to lose hope, blaming Moses for their increased misery. But Moses wasn't about to give up. With God's backing, he returned to Pharaoh again and again, warning him of what was to come if he didn't let the Israelites go. And so began a series of events that would forever be remembered as the 10 plagues of Egypt, God's judgment on Pharaoh and his people. Each of the 10 plagues was a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt, showing Pharaoh and his people that the God of Israel was more powerful than anything they worshipped. These plagues weren't random. They were carefully chosen, each one escalating in severity. 1. Water turned to blood. The Nile River, which was considered the life source of Egypt, turned to blood. All the fish died, and the water became undrinkable. This was a direct strike against Hapi, the Egyptian god of the Nile. 2. Frogs. Frogs invaded every inch of Egypt. Homes, kitchens, and even beds were filled with frogs. This was a blow to Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. 3. Lice. Dust turned into tiny gnats or lice covering people and animals. This plague targeted Geb, the god of the earth. 4. Flies. Swarms of flies filled the land, spreading disease and misery. 5th, livestock disease. Egypt's cattle, sheep, and horses were struck with a deadly disease, crippling their agriculture and economy. This was a judgment against Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of protection. 6. Boils. Painful boils broke out on the skin of every Egyptian, including the priests and magicians who had initially tried to mimic some of the earlier plagues. 7. Hail. A fierce hailstorm, unlike anything Egypt had ever seen, destroyed crops and killed anyone caught outside. 8. Locusts. Whatever crops survived, hail were devoured by locusts that swept through the land. 9. Darkness. A deep, unnatural darkness fell over Egypt for 3 days, symbolizing God's supremacy over Ra, the sun god. 10th. Death of the firstborn, the final and most devastating plague. Every firstborn in Egypt, from the richest to the poorest families, including Pharaoh's own son, died in one night. The angel of death passed over the homes of the Israelites, who had marked their doorposts with the blood of a lamb. With this final plague, Pharaoh was finally broken. His grief over the death of his son, along with the cumulative destruction of the plagues, forced him to relent. He summoned Moses in the middle of the night and told him to take the Israelites and leave Egypt at once. The Israelites, who had been slaves for generations, were finally free. They left in haste, with their families, livestock, and everything they could carry. But even after the Israelites had left, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. Realizing he had lost his entire labor force, he regretted his decision. In a final act of defiance, Pharaoh assembled his chariots and his army and pursued the Israelites. The Israelites, led by Moses, had reached the edge of the Red Sea. With the sea in front of them and Pharaoh's army rapidly closing in behind, the people panicked. They cried out to Moses, accusing him of leading them to their deaths. But Moses, full of faith, reassured them, saying, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14:13. Then, in one of the most famous miracles in the Bible, Moses stretched out his hand over the Red Sea, and the waters parted. A pathway of dry ground appeared, allowing the Israelites to cross safely to the other side. Pharaoh and his army, determined to recapture them, followed closely behind. Once the Israelites had crossed, God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand again. As Pharaoh and his army were still in the middle of the sea, the waters came crashing back together. The chariots and soldiers were swallowed by the sea, drowning every last one of them. Pharaoh, the mighty ruler who had defied God, had met his end. Though the Bible doesn't explicitly state whether Pharaoh himself died in the sea, it is commonly believed that he perished along with his army. His once mighty reign came to a sudden and crushing halt. The destruction of Pharaoh and his army marked the end of Israel's bondage and the beginning of their journey to the Promised Land. On the other side of the sea, the Israelites sang a song of victory, praising God for his mighty deliverance. This moment would become a cornerstone of their faith, a reminder that no force, no matter how powerful, can stand against the will of God.